Hi everyone, thanks for being patient and good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar on prevention of violent extremism. I'm Kendra and I'm from the communications team at UNDP in Sri Lanka, and I will be your moderator for this webinar this afternoon. So just to give a quick insight as to what the Engage, Disengage program is. This is an awareness building training program which has been developed by UNDP Sri Lanka in partnership with the Asia Pacific Center of Education for International Understanding under the auspices of UNESCO, which focuses on critical media and information literacy for youth. This webinar series, which is organized in partnership with Raw Media, is part of a tripart webinar series on the topics of critical media literacy, conspiracy theories and fake news, and today's topic, which is the prevention of violent extremism. So just to start off, we want to put in a few house rules before we get into the session. So this is a 1-hour session and will be recorded for program purposes. At the end of the presentation by the experts, we will move on to a Q&A session where we would like to engage with you all. So please do type in your questions into the Q&A or chat box, and we will direct these to the experts present here today. If you would still like to explain or elaborate on your question and would like to use your mic, please raise your hand and the panelists will unmute you and give you the opportunity to speak. But please do keep in mind that to keep your questions short due to the time constraints that we are working with. So let me hand it over to our two experts today. Let me introduce our experts. We have Sakina Razik, who is a journalist at Raw Media, who's passionate about social justice and change. She's interested in economics, international relations, and human-centric stories. Prior to this, she has worked at a local think tank as a researcher. And we also have with her Chris Thomas, who is also a journalist for Raw Media, an avid follower of stories of the lesser known, unheard, and often unspoken human conditions. He has worked in print media and digital media previously and has reported on various such subjects. So over to you, Chris and Sakina.
Thank you, Kendra. So as Kendra mentioned, we work for an organization called Raw Media, where we cover different topics and we do articles and videos, social media posts, and we're very particularly limited to the digital media platform, yes. So today we're talking about prevention of violent extremism and hate speech and connecting it to our knowledge as journalists and how to stay safe on the internet.
Basically, we are going to discuss what we have experienced and hopefully you guys might learn something new out of this. To start off, violent extremism is not a new thing. It has been there since people started killing each other. But what has happened now is that it's not constricted to a particular border. It has become an international phenomenon and has gone beyond a particular country or a state and has more or less engulfed the entire world. And one major way of combating or being aware of this is through information. But information is also a manner in which violent extremism can spread, which is where hate speech comes in. If you look at the slide here, it gives like a proper definition taken from Geneva Center of Security Policy on what violent extremism is and what it intends to do to a society or a social institution.
And we will be connecting this to hate speech particularly, and then taking us through some examples. Which hopefully will explain more. So hate speech itself has been kind of difficult globally to even just define, and it's something that has existed way long before, which we'll go into a bit after this. But the idea of hate speech has become more and more prominent over maybe the last 10 to 20 years.
Over the last decade?
Yeah, definitely over the last decade. And a big part of the problem has been the advent of social media, because prior to social media, you generally had a gatekeeper of information, an author, or somebody who you could attribute that information. But with social media, just anonymity became larger, and it was just so much harder to control. So I'm just taking a very basic definition of a UN strategy document, where hate speech is described as any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are. So in other words, it could be based on their religion, on their ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other identity factor. So it's really, really broad, this idea of hate speech, but this idea is that you attack someone for exactly like a particular reason. And when you take it in terms of international law, it's become really important because hate speech, as Chris mentioned, has actually been a tool that has been used to propagate violent extremism. So here, it has been important to have a legal structure that actually addresses hate speech. But it's so much harder because it's hard to define in the first place, and then so much harder to apply. And for example, in Sri Lanka, we ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights Convention, ICCPR, in 2007. And in 2007, we passed the legal act. Because ideally in Sri Lanka, you can ratify as many conventions as you want, but it's not actually applicable until you have an actual domestic law in the country. So we do have a domestic law. There are lots of questions and debates and contention around this particular law. And one big problem there is about the definition itself. So there's a section 3(1) in the ICCPR Act, the local ICCPR Act, that says no person shall advocate national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. So automatically it establishes a few things. One is that it's not just saying you're prohibiting hate speech, you're prohibiting hate speech that incites violence. Something. Yes, no, not just violence, like discrimination, hostility. But how do you even describe like how do you define what is hostility? Then you have to take it case by case, and like who decides this? Obviously, it's a legal authority.
I think the bigger problem is that every case would be unique, and implementation of it is becomes harder and harder.
Absolutely. And then also it says religious, national, and racial. But when I was first talking about hate speech, there was also gender and identity and descent there and color, and so those haven't been included in this legal definition. So there itself you kind of see problems with the law. And the ICCPR Act is not the only law. Actually, we have the Prevention of Terrorism Act, PTA, and the Penal Code also that addresses this. But the other problem, in addition to having the law and then having problems with the definition, is also its implementation. And in our country, there's a lot of debate around this as well, and it also seems to have been selective to certain cases.
Yes. And there have been so many examples which have occurred recently. One particular author, Shastika Satkumara, who was arrested under the provisions of the ICCPR Act for writing a story, a fictional short story that spoke about, that characterized a particular Buddhist clergyman as being homosexual. That was taken as grounds of defamation, or as in harmful.
Against going against a religion. But then there has been debate that this technically didn't incite violence. So does this actually come under hate speech?
And also incidences where ICCPR was used to arrest a woman who was wearing a cloth that showed what was claimed to be the Buddhist Dharma Chakra, and she was also charged under ICCPR, but was recently released.
Yeah, just very recently.
And the ICCPR, one of the biggest problems with the ICCPR would be that there are no cases where prosecution completed. Right?
Yes, so I think in terms of cases that haven't been considered, so other instances of violence against different communities or groups that has not actually seen an actual prosecution, which is the reason for the debate about the use of the ICCPR Act. And yeah, so these are a few of the problems that surround on a legal basis. But now we're going to move into a little bit about why hate speech is still so important to tackle. And then Sri Lanka is not the only country that's really struggling. It's a global problem on how to tackle hate speech. And
it has happened for
quite some time. That even stems back to World War II.
World War II as you would know, targeted the Jewish community and the rest of the world as well, because of hate speech manifested in like the simplest form of Adolf Hitler giving a speech to the masses in his infuriatingly good oratory skills.
Yeah, he was known to be a fabulous orator.
Yeah, and not just the speeches, it also manifested in like the forms of government propaganda. If you take the example, like the cartoon that's shown on the left-hand side, that was a cartoon that was published in Der Stürmer. It's a newspaper that was doing its rounds in Nazi Germany. Der Stürmer means the attacker, and it depicts the Jewish community or Jewish people as basically the devil carrying the Talmud, the religious text of the Jewish community. And it also meant that hate speech also not just particularly marginalized or victimized ethnic groups, but also people of color, where the Ku Klux Klan is the best example. A white supremacist group that targeted or like that tried to police Black Americans during the 1970s, and even now, it's forms of that particular group keeps popping up every now and then.
And we see how hate speech is not just, limited to what we talk about now is social media, but when it goes back in history to connect to just addressing the masses, that's one form of information flow. And then as print media, it's even about how Hitler was reported on and how the journalists reported them in their print media about these cartoons. And then also, for example, these little notices that you see from the KKK.
And the journalists, even then, the group, the mainstream media or like the world media was divided. There were journalists or media organizations that advocated to Hitler's or whatever the racial racial sentiments that were being propagated. But there was also the other side where they directly stood against it or criticized. So that division was always there. But and you can see that now as well.
And another form that was really used was the radio. And a big example of this is during the lead up to the Rwandan genocide, which happened in 1994 by Hutu extremists against the minority group Tutsis. And so this is just an excerpt from one of the radio stations that was against Tutsis, and they would just keep repeating the same message. Notice to all, they would call the Tutsis cockroaches, and they would refer to these cockroaches as not really belonging to Rwanda, and how there needs to be a cleansing of these cockroaches. So imagine you're just a citizen and you just keep hearing this message over and over and over again. And then, this is just not the only message, multiple, like you could even find the transcripts online, so many in not just English, but also in French and in the Rwandan language. And then also, no, that's not Swahili. And then also, in particular, some of it would just be academic discussions about the legitimacy of the Tutsis in Rwandan land, and this would really, really confuse people, and to the point that the genocide in Rwanda that happened in 1994 it saw in such a short span of time, so in 100 days, between 800,000 to 1 million people were slaughtered, and statistics also point to the fact that more than 6 men, women, and children were murdered every minute of every hour of every day of those 100 days. So here you see how something small, a small message is playing on the radio, which was a private media station that they had decided to create because a lot of the other media stations did not agree with this current message. What it can possibly lead to.
It's more or less a form of brainwashing, right? You repeat the message so many times, it just leads to this kind of
and you think that you can be immune to it, but I think it's easier said than done, because you're just always reading or listening to one thing. And
and Sri Lanka hasn't been an exemption in this case. We have seen our own riots. These are some of course the 2014 and the 2018 anti-Muslim riots have been like the most contemporary examples that we can think of. But even before, there were riots that targeted communities, that marginalized communities.
And sorry, just to step in there, when we were talking about Rwanda, like that was in 1994.
Yeah.
And since then, we've also seen a change in how conflict has been happening or has taken place, where over the last decade, there's also been a rise of a different actor, particularly these terrorist groups. Because most often before, conflicts were, so you either had the world wars or you had what you call new wars. And the conflicts were particularly within a certain region and were within a certain country. I mean, exactly.
Yeah.
We saw that in Sri Lanka as well. Like the last 30 years, our civil war was about our particular country. And with the advent of terrorism, what created there was a different group that nobody knew how to even deal with. And they weren't related to a particular country, but an ideology. And they used religion and a twisted form of religion for their own means and their own gains, which meant that suddenly addressing extremist violence just became so much more harder. And yeah, and I think it kind of led to a rising phenomenon where initially it was even limited to certain countries, and then it started to become global. And you see how Sri Lanka's current context is being a part of this global conversation too.
Yeah. And speaking of like the LTT and civil war, it's sort of unique. Violent extremism against the Tamil community manifested in the form of the 1983 riots and so many other violent incidents that happened. As a result, the conflict between the LTT and the Sri Lankan government resulted in a traditional war between two armies, but it has escalated so much differently now in the global context that you're not, like, states are not fighting terrorists or within their own countries.
Again, this is technology. It's
you're more or less fighting technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
And,
technology is helping you or not helping you, and it's just a whole other space.
Yeah.
So that's why these riots
are really important. If you take into consideration the 2014 Aludgama riots, so that was one of the recent riots where you saw, like, social media was not technically blacked out. But during the later riots that occurred, social media was completely blacked out, but mainstream media was somewhat informed. And you can still report from there, but information that was coming out was more or less controlled. And if you want to, talk about this?
So I think another event that we saw in Sri Lanka was the Easter Sunday attacks, which was difficult and extremely painful. And I think here was also information flows had different parts to play. There was fake news, there was disinformation, there was actual information. And then when the country just needed to heal, there was an aftermath that happened after the Easter Sunday attacks that was kind of fueled by this use of social media. And again, here the point is how media and information flows can kind of create a narrative that you don't really want.
And if you compare these two events, compare the Easter Sunday attack with maybe a terrorist attack that was perpetrated by the LTT a couple of years ago. If you compare the information that would have come out in that particular incident and what happened during the Easter Sunday attack, social media was more or less unheard of during the period before 2009. It was not prevalent as it is now. So states had more power over the information that was coming out, but compared to what happened in Easter Sunday, which resulted in a social media blackout, the information was more or less an overload. Everyone had something to say, and
that whole week it was just social media. You didn't know what to believe.
Yeah.
And
this is actually the aftermath of what happened. People started talking about, there were various debates whether to ban the burqa or to from banning the burqa to the halal certification, which also resulted in some violent incidences that happened a couple of weeks after the Easter Sunday attack. This is the result of hate speech and violent extremism. These are more or less the indirect effects, I would say. Would that be correct?
Some indirect, some direct, I think. And the other point here is that hate speech itself is a problem.
Yeah.
You know, it has been a problem since before World War II. I mean, we just use one of the early examples as World War II, but it has continued, and it's only just getting worse. And with social media, it's just a click of a button, and nobody knows who's shared what. Nobody wants to even double check or fact check, and it can change mindsets, and it could lead to violence.
Yeah.
Yes. So moving on from those contemporary examples to a lot more very recent is the COVID-19 pandemic. And here is that we saw a time period where people were stuck at home. They couldn't move. So information was even more essential. It's almost like everything, and then specifically digital information, what you could find. And also we saw during this time that there were certain media houses that didn't completely follow media ethics, and went also particularly targeted certain communities, individuals, the way things are reported, even just the lack of like holding privacy, and thinking about the people, sharing addresses, sharing names, sharing ages.
It was so bad that we saw journalists or cameramen going and shoving cameras down people's faces and asking unnecessary questions from them, that would put them in an uncomfortable position. And that is not ethical at all.
Absolutely. And
it became so bad that the government had to intervene. Right?
Yeah, and it was a difficult time to report, even for us, because you don't have access like you normally do. You can't step out as you normally would. You need a curfew pass. And then also the people that you talk to sometimes would have had a bad experience with certain media houses, so they would not be willing to talk to you again, because they'd be like, oh, they reported my name wrong, they reported my age wrong. I didn't want some of this information to be out there.
It was really bad because the media started releasing people in some way.
Yeah, and really creating some sort of stigma if you had contracted COVID, which that personally think shouldn't have happened. And so that was a point where we saw the government get involved.
The Ministry of Health had to issue specific guidelines on how to report COVID-19 and the pandemic, and in such a way that it doesn't really harm the public or incite violence or make people uncomfortable. This was actually one of the, I think, few occasions where the government had to intervene and issue guidelines on regulating media and reporting.
I still think the only issue is that we still haven't seen anything long term. So if you're going to address,
it's very reactionary.
It's very reactionary. There's no so even this is specific to COVID, but I think that we've been speaking about a lot of problems within just our country, and we haven't really thought about what big solutions are there for accountability for the media, to ensure media ethics are undertaken, and just good reporting.
The media does have responsibilities in this particular case when it comes to identifying and paying attention or giving attention to hate speech and violent extremism. We have to realize that we as journalists or citizen journalists have our own biases. That has to be taken into consideration. We have to identify our own biases and prejudices and keep them away when we are writing or reporting a story. And one of the major things that goes amiss when it comes to mainstream media is that media ethics is more or less unheard of. And that's why you see camera crews and reporters running around more or less harassing individuals, eyewitnesses, people to get that particular good story. So education on media ethics is very important. And
verify. I think this is it's difficult. It's not always easy. You're working against a really tough timeline. You need to move fast with the information. Information is rapidly changing all the time, so it's sometimes very difficult, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was extremely hard to verify because you didn't have the same kind of access, and not everybody was working in the same capacity. Everybody was working from home. How do you call a government agency and contact them if you don't have their personal number? So verifying is difficult, but it's so important, and the simplest act of not verifying and reporting wrong can have serious, dire consequences.
And conflict-sensitive reporting is also important because take Easter Sunday for an example. If you were a journalist or a reporter at that particular scene, how would you approach a victim in that particular incident? Where would you draw the line of harassing and like getting the story, harassing the individual and getting the story? So, similarly, during the lockdown, how would you get the story while being sensitive towards the person you're interviewing or talking to, knowing that he or she might have gone through some traumatic incident?
Did you particularly struggle?
Easter Sunday, yes, definitely. It was very hard to do interviews with these people, like while keeping in mind that this is something that they have gone through, but I have a responsibility to get that story across. So you have to be extra sensitive. You have to understand where these people are coming from, that they are suffering, that they're hurting internally. They might not cry to your face, but that they are in pain. That they have to be treated in a humane way is essential, I would say. And multicultural awareness is something Sri Lanka loves to be called like a multicultural country, but not everyone would adhere to that. So it's the same with like maybe organizations in your office. You might be working with multicultural people, but you wouldn't have that same knowledge of what their practices are, like that intimate knowledge.
And I think here it's just accepting that you don't know,
yeah.
and learning is a big part, because a lot of people like to talk, but not everyone likes to listen. And that is really helpful, because I think it's okay not to know. And I think this is something, I mean, these are facts that we are also a bit, we struggle with in our field as well.
It's good to not know, but it's our responsibility to learn it. Otherwise, you're going to remain ignorant. Ignorance is not the good thing to do, not the good practice. And also, hate speech crimes rarely get reported. So witnesses have to be encouraged, and survivors of it have to be encouraged. The story has to come out so that everyone gets to know about it. That awareness has to be developed.
And one of the difficulties there is that not everyone knows if what has happened to them is an actual situation of hate speech. And when we say hate speech, I mean, we talk a lot about religion and racial and even nationality, but we don't also talk about how gender is also a part of identity, and who your descent, or maybe a caste, or anything that targets you as a person is kind of falls within that like spectrum of hate speech, and that deserves reporting. And that deserves attention, and then you should report it. So if it's on social media, I mean, you should report it. And I think that is a responsibility of multiple stakeholders to really address,
from the state to the lowest, like the smallest unit of it, which is you, and you have to have that responsibility. You have to implement it, and that's how you hold people accountable. Once you report it, once you call them out, is when the perpetrators, or the people who are basically the perpetrators, are held accountable, and that's how you deal with hate speech.
Yeah, and I think another thing is just like accountability of media houses. It's hard as just to say, but I think that's important as well, because then people need to know that there is a process to be able to address something that is unfair.
It's all interconnected, right? If that internal accountability comes from like good practices, good practice of ethics. So that's why like each of these steps are connected.
That's true. So just gonna get into a small example of why it's important to
not call that a small example.
Why it's really important for you as a citizen to understand, to know, and just know what's out there. And this is specific to social media. So an expert has actually described ISIS information almost similar to a news agency, because this is how much they publish every day. So there's 3 videos per day, 15 photographic reports, 90,000 social media posts per day, 46,000 to 70,000 pro-ISIS Twitter posts per day. That's more than most media houses in like globally. And they also have a print, they have a magazine. So there is a lot that they are doing to make sure that their information is going out there. So, and with no rules per se. I know that most like Facebook and lots of social media companies have started to have to take a stance. Absolutely. Because
I think this is why there are like hate speech monitors that are coming out.
Yeah.
Like, that are so prevalent. Even after Easter Sunday, we saw local think tanks developing hate speech monitors that have been active since then. They are still active now as well. But if you take this particular example, it shows how much things have changed with the advantage of social media. If you draw parallels with Nazi Germany and its propaganda, which was restricted to speeches from traditional publications.
You actually had to
radio.
Physically make it there for a speech. You actually had to buy the newspaper and read it to get your information.
And compared to that, this is so much easier, and the reach is so much more. So it's so large that.
And it's important to just know that this is the reality. And getting to our final slide on how to stay safe on the internet. So this is our third and last webinar out of this series,
and it's all connected.
And it's everything's connected. So we're just kind of tying everything in, where we point out how we spoke about critical media literacy in our first webinar, which is about really understanding
what is
being reported, who is reporting, what are the power sources behind who is reporting what they're reporting, and when you take the ISIS example, just having that kind of knowledge or just kind of antenna that tells you, do I know what exactly I'm reading?
What's the purpose of this message?
Exactly. Why are they sending it to me? Can really help you stay safe on the internet. And
when it comes to whatever the information you come across is. You have to understand whether it's actual factual news, facts, or fake news. Understanding like fake news is also important, like distinguishing propaganda from misleading news to misreported information to actual facts is vital in this particular case as well.
Yeah, and we spoke about, you spoke about in your second webinar about how to really identify fake news, how to debunk it, and there are tools that you can use it. It's not just tools, but there have been independent actors in this field, like, fact-checking organizations that have come up because there's been such a need for it. And I think having that knowledge and just helps you be more responsible. So there is no big answer or big solution to how to stay safe on the internet. It's just a lot about.
It's a matter of common sense, developing a common sense.
And practice. Like sometimes it's hard to even always be so on the ball when you are reading it. You scroll while you're not thinking. You do it right now, just getting on social media. You do this at different points of the day. Yeah. And in such a situation, I think that it's a practice that you just kind of inherently have to develop.
It's a sense that you have to develop.
Absolutely. And the last one is to take action. So if you are not sure about something, do not share. Do not just read the headline and just share.
People do that
article. Yes. Headlines can be misleading. Headlines can be there to attract somebody's attention but not give you the full message. So that's really important. Social media, report something on social media if you feel that it is harmful and this content is harmful. And feel free to verify using any kind of fact check tools and debunk it if you are unsure.
If you see something that you know is wrong, call it out. Call them out, and that's how you fight fake news and hate speech, combat hate speech. And knowing that, obtaining that information itself is the first step of staying safe on the internet, I would say.
Yeah.
Any questions?
We hope this helped, and we're happy to take questions, Kendra.
Thanks, Chris and Sakina. That was very comprehensive. I think we've already started to get a few questions, but just a reminder to everyone who's on the call to please type in your questions in either the Q&A or chat box section, and we will try and answer as many as possible. Just to start off, we personally just want to check with the two of you all as journalists, what has been like the hardest incident that you all have had to personally cover in relation to these kind of incidences that have happened in the recent past? Any personal experiences that you would like to share?
I've had the misfortune of covering both the Ghana riots and the Easter Sunday attacks. So those incidents have definitely left a mark, and that experience itself is unique in such a way that you learn a lot of things as a journalist, and you develop that sense of like knowing that you have to be sensitive towards these people that you're talking to, knowing that they have gone through this traumatic incident, and it's a different way of talking, like not the normal interview per se, but you become extra sensitive towards these people, towards these communities as well. So yeah, it's definitely one of the harder incidences.
Yeah, and I think mine would possibly be during COVID. Yeah, because sometimes it's just so much easier to establish a connection when you can directly talk to the person. But now you're talking to them over the phone. You are trying to convince them that you are going to use this information in a proper manner, use this sensitive information, and make sure that you don't harm them in any way. And that's difficult. And how do they trust you? You're just somebody who's gotten their number and call them, and then you're asking them for their story because you've read about it, or you've heard about it, or somebody's put you in touch. So that was really difficult. Even
that
just
lack of connection.
Yeah, that lack of connection, that kind of human connection, was really difficult. I think the one other instance that's not related to a crisis, but this particularly was just when I was doing a piece on mothers who have lost their babies through miscarriage or stillbirths, and I met this mother who was willing to talk to me, but it was she had just lost her baby in the last week, was still so fresh, and that particular memory and to have that conversation and to put her at ease, to make sure that you don't make her uncomfortable and you only talk to her about anything that she's comfortable with, but also staying true to the information, make sure you get the information. That was something I even had to have like a chat with my editor before I went for this interview because I was a bit worried. But yeah.
Thanks both for that. We have another question on how, like in mainstream media, right at the moment also, we see a lot of this kind of hate speech that is happening, whether it's live TV, radio, whatever, whichever the platform is. Is there something, how come nothing is being done to stop them? And is there some kind of act or ethical code that they need to be following?
As in, the question would be like, is the government doing anything to stop them, or like, is there anything internally within the media organization that they're doing to?
Or just any structure, I think.
Any structure?
Yeah, any kind of structure to stop these kind of mainstream media also propagating?
The government really can't regulate media. At least government can't regulate private media organizations. They have somewhat control, most of the control over state media when it comes to the content that's published, but when it comes to private media, they have a wider freedom of what they publish and what they can put out. Internally, it's different from organization to organization. The structure becomes fluid depending on the organization. So that's why you see a lot of say different reports coming on particular incident coming from like various organizations would be completely different to each other. Like every report, every news story would be different, even if it's discussing one particular case. So I wouldn't say there's no hard and fast answer to this, but it's unique from case to case.
Thanks for that. We also have a question, I think something similar to what when you all shared your personal experience in interviewing people during these kind of incidents. It's not always easy to interview people, especially if it's related to sensitive issues like the Easter attack. So what would be your personal way to make them feel less uncomfortable and share in their thinking, and how to best get them to share with you as journalists?
You can take it up specific to Easter Sunday attacks, yeah. I think. So I'll just say that I think just talking to them and really, really listening. So to the point that you just ask a question, but you are not talking too much, you're listening and listening to cues and respecting that boundary if that person is uncomfortable. Like, you have to be able to say no, because if you force a story out of somebody, that story is not really valid. It's almost like, and you might even have to retract the story somewhere down the line if that person thinks about it and it's like, oh, I was never comfortable with this. This journalist actually really didn't respect my rights. So I think making sure that comfort and that acceptance is there at the beginning, and for that, it might take even just like 15 minutes of just talking, explaining. Sometimes you have to show what you publish, how you write, talk about the teams that you have, talk about the issue at hand, say how you're going to write it and how you're going to report it. So in my experience, the more information that they have, that the person you hope to interview, the more comfortable they are. That's that. And also assuring them that you will respect their privacy and assuring them that they have this communication with you even after. So you're not just going to kind of disappear out of there. They can call you and they can look at the article once it's up, and if they're really unhappy with it. So I mean, it's a difficult line, because it's also like our job to report the story and report it in the best way that we think is best. But that's how I just go based on conversation.
Yeah, there's definitely a fine line. It's not a blurry line between like harassment and like properly empathizing with that person you're interviewing. I think empathy is definitely a good
skill that you need to have.
In order, it's not just you talking to a person; it's you assuring that person that whatever the information that that person is giving to us will be used in the correct manner. That their story will be told in the best possible way. If I were to take like an Easter Sunday example, when you go into like the Kochikade area right after what happened, and I take my own photographs as well as a reporter. So I have my backpack and like I would go there, and they would obviously, I would sense this discomfort in that particular community whenever they saw me wearing that backpack. And there were occasions where they actually asked me like questions, and I had to go through a lot of convincing and then reassuring them that I was a journalist and that I'm here to tell a story. And it's a lot. It's a very difficult situation that you're forced into. But if you have to develop that sense of
being kind, and just developing that one, because ultimately there's no point if that person doesn't want to talk to you. And if that person doesn't want to talk to you, I think respecting that boundary, realizing that this story is not worth harming somebody or making that person feel small or unhappy or uncomfortable, and just kind of stepping away.
Yeah, you should know when to step away when like the story is not working out. If that person is not comfortable, step away, find someone else to talk to.
Thank you both for that. We have two questions which are a little similar, so I'll just couple it and we can, I think, answer it together. So one is, can stereotyping of genders, religions, ethnicities, professions, or even looks, which include hair, tattoos, clothing, etc., be a trigger for hate speech and extremism of any sort? Linking it to that is does the legal system in Sri Lanka consider hatred towards a specific gender or transgender communities as hate speech? Do you have anything to say on that?
So our legal structure and framework does not cover gender, or it doesn't cover transgenders very specifically. The penal code is always a lot broader, so it speaks about things like the rights of people. So that kind of
constitution.
Yeah, and the constitution. So that kind of question will possibly only ever be answered in an actual case in law, and to my knowledge, I don't think we've ever actually had a case like that. And a legal expert would be much better at answering this particular question. But we definitely don't have a specific law specifically. So even in our SCCPR Act, right, we don't have the word gender in that when we talk about that section 3, subsection 1. So it doesn't speak about gender specifically. It'll talk about rights on a whole, and talk about respecting people on a whole. So that could be constituted. But it really depends when and if a case is ever taken up, and how lawyers and judges and how so sometimes even laws are not the only way to guide you in certain situations, but cases and decisions taken in cases are also considered. So that's the only
whenever
way.
like a judge comes across like a difficult case that doesn't really, if he or she believes that there's no precedence to it, he would obviously go back and review the existing literature, which is previous court cases and the decisions previous judges have given them.
Yeah.
So they would
so
get
that's why we don't want to say a hard no.
Yeah.
But there is definitely none that I can point a finger out and say, oh, actually refer to this law.
Yeah.
There is such.
Actually, a legal expert would have given a good answer to that.
Thank you. We also have another question. As individuals or young people, what can we do to prevent violent extremism? We've spoken of in the media and as journalists, but as like an individual, what should, especially as young people, what can we do?
That's the last slide.
Yeah, but I think it's about having a responsibility to yourself.
Absolutely.
What are you reading? How are you understanding this? And what are you sharing? And if it's almost like a lot of people like to point fingers at other people for certain flaws, but do you ever look back and reflect on yourself? It's the same thing with how you deal with media and how you understand media and how you spread media. Are you doing it correctly? Are you doing it the best way that you can? Have you put some time and energy and research into addressing this? And that is, I think, one of the main steps. The rest of it is it can stem from sharing properly to then actually taking a step to maybe
reviewing what is being reported.
Yeah, and then educating closer circles,
Yeah.
and then maybe
if you see your friends sharing what you know is wrong, if you see your family talking about what you know is wrong, again, call them out, debunk them. Like, there are so many WhatsApp messages that carry fake news that get circulated on a daily basis. People don't think twice before sharing. So that has to stop, and for that to happen, it has to start somewhere. Like, one person can start that and educate the rest of them. That's where it started.
Yes, I think that's very individual based. If you
Yeah.
really want, if you notice something, an error, you can always communicate the media house and talk to them about it. Ask for a correction, and that's another bigger step, if at all. But I think it's mainly still very individual based and specific to you and life.
So I think we are running out of time, so we'll have to come to a close. Sorry for the questions that we could not tackle, but thank you very much for being engaging with all of us. So just to conclude, this brings us to the end of our webinar series on the Engage, Disengage program. But in the coming weeks, we will also be conducting this in both Sinhala and Tamil. So please do have a look out for it on our social media, and you can also share this with your friends and your networks. So please do stay tuned for that. This webinar series, which covered media literacy, conspiracy theories, false news, and the prevention of violent extremism today, was conducted as a lead up to the training program that we have scheduled for this through our program. And it's offered in partnership with UNDP and UNESCO APSU. So as participants of this webinar, you too could also sign up for this. So please do stay tuned. You will get more details from us soon on how you can also be a part of this training program, which will definitely add value to your everyday work. So to close off, just want to say a big thank you to our partners, UNESCO APSU and Raw Media, for making this possible. Thank you to Sakina and Chris for being a part of this afternoon's webinar and the webinar series throughout. Thank you for making it engaging and interesting experiential learning for all of us. Thank you to all of you who participated this afternoon. And like we said, do stay tuned on our social media for further details. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you, Kendra.
Thank you.
Thank you.